In Roach Reflections today, I want to talk about dace and roach together. In my early days fishing on the Piddle and the Froome around Wareham, I caught far more dace than roach. And as time went on, I tried to figure out how to catch the roach instead of the dace. Sometimes it was easy, I just caught roach and very few dace. Other times there were lots and lots of dace present with just the odd roach. Sometimes the roach present were fairly small. And then as time went on, I gained experience on the Dorset Stour. And back in those days, and we're talking in the 80s mainly onwards, there were far more dace in the Stour than there are now. One of the shortcuts, the quickest shortcut to catching roach amongst the dace was to fish with bread. It's one of the reasons I still like bread in the winter on the Stour. It tends to pick out the roach. And even on the Froome, going back when I first retired, which is around 2009, 2010, it was possible to fish on the Froome in the evenings and catch quite a lot of roach using bread punch over ground bait. Still caught plenty of dace, but the bread picked out the roach more than the dace. Not talking big fish, some over £1, and lots of fairly standard shoal fish, shall we say, sort of 4 to 8 ounces. But nice, pleasant fishing, catching quality fish. And the same on the Stour really. And I must admit, though I've caught an awful lot of dace, I can't get excited about them in the same way that I do about roach. Not saying I get that excited about roach, but catching lots and lots of dace, which was something I did a huge amount of in the 70s and 80s, as I say, sometimes later than that in matches, was something I could just sit and bag up on them back in those days. Catch 100 dace, 150 dace, and occasionally well over 200 dace. And as a match fishing skill, it was a vital one on the Stour, especially the lower Stour, and on the Froome. Matches on the towpath at Wareham were dominated by dace back in the 70s. My best match catch down there was £32. That was all dace. I think the match before I'd won as well with £16. Almost all dace, maybe one or two, with about 160 dace. So catching lots and lots of dace and knowing how to get a shoal of dace into the swim was important. And any roach that came along in those sort of matches were just bonus fish, if you like, that rarely made an awful lot of difference. But quite often we'd have entire matches on the towpath there where nothing but dace was weighed in, not a single roach caught. Whether the roach were there and just not caught, I don't know, or whether they were further upstream at the quay and above the bridge is hard to say after all these years. Certainly one of the earlier matches I fished there when I was still a junior, I was around about 15, and we could fish almost down to the yacht club on the towpath. I was surprised on the very bottom swim, which is no longer fishable. The pontoons on the yacht club were extended many years ago, and those sort of swims disappear. They're all grown in and unfishable with moorings. I was amazed to get about a dozen roach in a match, but they weren't very big ones, and there were quite a lot of these small fish around in the Froome at that time, which is 2 or 3 ounce fish, lots of them around. So I had about a dozen roach and a total catch of about 90 fish for £9, and there was quite a few small roach caught in that match. I think it's interesting to understand the difference between the roach and the dace in how they feed. The dace tend to want lighter shotting, lighter tackle, and the roach want the bait a bit steadier. So you can sometimes pick the roach out when you've got lots of both in a swim. In the summer it gets a bit different, especially on places like Throop fishery, which I try and fish a fair bit in the summer, and there can be lots and lots of small dace on there. It does vary quite a bit. I've had days where hardly any dace, and the dace can be a pain in the butt, to be honest with you, when you're fishing hemp and tears what you tend to get is the bait hardly hits the water. You get a very fast bite and you wind in half a tear. They've chewed off half the tear, but you've missed the bite. You do hook some of them. And the roach are much slower in biting. They tend to, you get a nice slow steady bite. I'm fishing up in the water quite often with quite small wagglers, only taking around about 3 BB and a couple of 10s down the line, and your bite from the roach is just that nice steady slow bite, and you just strike and you're in, and they're quite easy to hit. Whereas the dace, it's woof, gone, and you wind in, you've got no tear or half a tear, and you think, how on earth did you do that to me? And very few of them are really worth catching as far as the dace are concerned. The sort of big ones about 3 ounces. A lot of them can be half an ounce, 2 ounces. Once in a blue moon you'll get one that's 6 to 8 ounces, and that's about it. Bigger ones than that on the Stour are very few and far between nowadays. I did get one last winter of 10 ounces for the cameras. That's quite a good one on there nowadays, it seems. There was a time when Wimborne would produce 20-pound bags of pretty much all dace. You might get 2 or 3 small roach in it from certain swims, and I think those fish have largely gone now. One interesting thing about dace, when I've been roach fishing on the upper Stour, and this is harder to do now, you can still fish the style, but there was a time in the 80s where laying on with casters was a very good method on the upper Stour, especially places like Stour Pane, which we had back then. You'd find some slack water behind some lily beds and a nice hard gravel bottom to the swim, and fish double caster over depth on an 18 or a 20, sometimes single caster on a 20. And you'd feed a few casters, but only about every 20 minutes, about 20 casters, not every cast, because they didn't like the casters raining on their heads. And if you watched very, very carefully, you'd see a few tiny little bubbles coming up. And believe it or not, those bubbles were dace. Sometimes they were chub. You don't think of dace and chub bubbling, but they did. They were feeding on the bottom. And when you did get a dace on those, laying on hard like that, you'd be catching good roach up to a pound and a half. You'd sometimes pick up really good dace, 8, 9, 10 ounces, no bigger than that. But the thought of dace bubbling is something that I don't think I've ever seen anyone write about it or mention it anywhere in the books that I've got about. There's not many books on dace fishing generally, only 2 or 3 specific books. Quite a lot of books have a chapter or 3 on dace fishing, especially the older books. They tend to be just lumped in with books about roach fishing or, like I say, general course fishing books. On the Tidal Stour, when there were a lot of dace used to come up from Christchurch Harbour, when I was pleasure fishing, I'd often fish bread punch down there trying to pick out the roach, but it was possible to catch 20 pounds of dace on bread punch, which seems weird, but they really would scoff down the ground bait. You'd catch dace coughing it up, and very few roach with them, occasional bream. Remember one match getting over 20 pounds down there of almost all dace, 1 3-pound bream. Not enough to win. I think someone had 30 pounds of dace around the corner, and there were a couple more better weights than mine as well. But it just shows you, even when you're trying to be selective, it doesn't always apply to you. In a way, I miss the dace on, but they're not in the numbers that we used to get. On the parts of the upper Stour, they seem to be almost non-existent. One stretch I fished, I don't think I've caught a dace off there now for 6 years. Other bits, there's a fair few small ones, very small ones, no real quality ones. And I think that's a shame in a way. Like I say, I can't get fantastically excited about them, but it'd be nice to get a few half-pounders now and again. Last year on the Avon, I did get quite a lot of dace a couple of times, but mostly they were small ones. A few better ones. One day I had some around about 8 to 10 ounces in a swim that didn't seem to have any roach in it. It had little barbel and chub. Might have had, I don't think I had a gudgeon. I have had gudgeon out of the same swim, but no roach in that swim. And then subsequent to that, caught quite a lot of small dace out of 1 or 2 swims, which were of a size that weren't really that interesting, little tiny, these sort of 5-inch things, which are not that, I'm not that bothered about those really. But I think if you're roach fishing in the summer and autumn or even the winter and you're catching dace, think about whether what you're doing you can alter it in a way that might catch you roach. Does it mean your presentation you need a bit more weight down the line, or just use them as a way of making you think about your fishing? So I no longer care about catching £30 a day, so those days are gone. And Fred J. Taylor once wrote, took in the early 70s in the Old Fisherman magazine, about taking 2 friends to the Hampshire Avon somewhere and showing them the chub and barbel swims, and they asked him about a couple of glides and he said, "Oh, don't bother with those, they're full of dace," and he left them to it. Came back 3 hours later and they were just there bagging up on the dace. They'd ignored all his advice and they were quite happy to be sat there catching dace after dace after dace, all 4 to the pound or 3 to the pound, because Avon dace, when they're at their best, are very good. Probably the best chance for, if I ever do catch a pounder, it's probably more likely out of the Avon than anywhere else, certainly locally. The Froome's still got a few monsters in it. Maybe one day this summer I'll try again for them. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and it's goodbye for now.